welcome to Oregon Horse Council's Know Your Industry. My name is Brandy Ebner, Executive Director of the Council, and we're excited to be joined today by Kathy Hall, who is an attorney here in Oregon, who's going to give us a little bit of information and advice about the current situation that we have with the coronavirus, and knowing that not all facilities are going to be able to have keep their clients. And we know that some clients are in financial situations where they might not be able to pay for things like boarding and training. So we're assuming in the next few weeks, we're going to get more questions about this. And we wanted to bring Kathy on today and go ahead and give some great tips and advice of how we can prepare for that kind of situation. So Kathy, welcome today. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. It's nice to be here.
So let's start. If you are a person who owns a boarding facility or maybe trains horses for other people, what can you do in this situation to kind of get ahead if you know you have clients who are likely not able to pay their fees in the coming few weeks or months?
So I'm going to give you a little sort of mix of practical issues that you need to think about and some legal issues that you need to think about. And we'll start with the legal issues. Sort of what your options are that are available to you is going to depend on the language that's in your boarding agreement, assuming that you have a written boarding agreement. And so hopefully you've got some language in there that talks about timelines and your fee structure and what services you provide for those fees. So you might be able to make arrangements with your client to maybe change those services that you're providing, whether it be sort of perhaps backing off of a full training or a full board situation and perhaps providing some lesser level of service, which would then arguably provide them with an opportunity to pay less for whatever services you're providing. But they were going to have to then make up the difference. Or maybe instead of having a 12 by 12 stall with a run, maybe they get turned out into a pasture or some sort of other arrangement so that your cost is less, the expense to the customer is less. And that way, at least in the short term, maybe you can come up with something that's going to work. If you have a training situation where maybe instead of providing training services or lessons 5 days a week, maybe you go to something less than that so that you're not providing a higher level of service than whatever your client can pay for. But typically those kinds of situations have to be arranged on a 30-day in advance warning. But if you've got a willing client who's interested in doing that and you're willing to make those adjustments yourself, then you can sort of forego that 30-day waiting period and just do something right away. But you have to make sure that the two of you are in agreement on whatever that's going to be. If you can't reach an agreement with your customer, you might say, hey, here's your 30-day warning that as of May 1st or June 1st or whenever your next period begins on your boarding or your training agreement, that as of such and such date, here's the services I'm going to provide, here's the adjustments in my fee structure, and that gives them the time to make the decision on whether they want to continue to keep their horse there. And if they're not in a position to do that or don't want to agree to that, then they have the opportunity to leave in advance of that. From a practical perspective, you sort of have to think about a couple of different things. One is it's going to be more advantageous for you to have that conversation with your clients earlier rather than later, so that you get a sense of where they're at. They get a sense of sort of how hard-nosed you might want to be on this. And you can hopefully figure out a solution that works for the two of you sooner rather than later. I've been through these a few times, been through these situations with customers during the last recession. And unfortunately, sometimes people wait until there is a very significant amount of money that's due, especially if you have a situation with clients with multiple horses. That can get very costly very quickly. Perhaps it's better to just simply say, rather than the full amount of board, I'm willing to continue to provide my service as long as you pay me 3/4 or some lesser amount rather than the full amount. And on some level, as a practical matter, it's going to depend on how interested you are in preserving that relationship with that client. If preserving that is not really something that you're interested in, then you can cut them loose sooner rather than later. If you are interested in maintaining that relationship because it's gone back for several years, or they have a really nice group of horses, or you know, you think that might just be a short-term problem with that client, then you might be more proactive or more concerted in your efforts to keep them happy and keep them there and keep something that's going to work for you. You as the facility owner or the trainer have to decide for yourself, with your own financial picture in mind, how willing you are to extend your clients what it would amount to credit. If they're going to keep their horses with you and you're going to see a loss of income, you know, how far are you willing to take that before you are interested in actually taking steps to collect payment if payment is not going to be made voluntarily? And, you know, keep in mind, for every horse that you've got in training or every horse that's boarded in your stall for which you're not being paid in full, you know, that's potentially money that you may never recover, depending on how precarious your horse owner situation may be. If you've got a horse that's in good health, you know, hey, maybe it's not going to be too bad to keep them on your property and keep them healthy through this. But if you've got a client's horse that's in need of some serious medical attention or has a shoeing issue that needs regular attention, and so they've got to have, you know, the farrier there regularly providing rather intensive therapeutic shoeing, and the owner's not able to provide it, you know, what's your exposure going to be in having to cover those expenses? Because as long as that animal is in your care, you bear at least some responsibility of maintaining that animal at a minimum standard of care, whether the owner can pay for it or not. And then lastly, what's the value of the animal? You know, if you're talking about a $500 grade trail horse as opposed to a $50,000 or $100,000 show horse, you know, that analysis might look a little bit different. It's really not in your financial best interest, perhaps, to allow the owner of the $500 grade horse to run up a $5,000 training bill with you or a $5,000 boarding bill with you, because the collateral that you're holding to cover yourself or protect yourself, secure that payment, isn't going to go very far at the end of the day. But if that horse is worth, you know, $50,000 or $100,000, and you know, you can perhaps be in a little bit safer position to say, gee, if that horse runs up a $5,000 bill, or that owner runs up a $5,000 bill on this horse, and I can hold that as collateral to secure payment at the end of the day, you know, maybe that's a calculation that you're a little more willing to make. So kind of those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah. And I know our internet's kind of a little bit, but I think we can still easily get the gist of what you're saying. So that's something I've heard in, unfortunately, in the horse world, is people saying, you know, I have a client, they didn't pay me, so I'm taking their horse and I'm selling it now to pay myself back. It's not that cut and dry, is it?
Absolutely not. So it's not automatic that the animal becomes yours unless that person is willing to sign over ownership of that horse to you. And you should not assume that simply because they are not paying you for the service that they had previously paid you for, that they have actually abandoned that horse and you can treat it as abandoned property. It's a very specific sort of set of circumstances that has to exist for an animal to be considered abandoned. And the fact that you are not, the owner of that animal is not paying you any longer, that's not going to constitute abandonment. Now, you could have some language written into your boarding agreement that says, hey, if you don't pay for your horse for 90 days or 120 days, you as the owner, or you as the boarding facility owner, or you as the trainer might have a language in there that says at that point, we'll consider it to be abandoned. And that abandonment is then by virtue of contractual agreement, not by virtue of some other function of the law. There is, in the absence of specific language in your boarding agreement, and I apologize, there's a truck driving by. In the absence of specific language in your contract, you would then fall back on state statutes. And state statutes, there's a couple of different options that would be available to you. The first is the state statute for a possessory lien on an animal that you're providing care for or that you have in your possession. there is a foreclosure process that you have to follow through with, and that involves providing notice to the animal owner and then advertising the sale of that animal, and then actually going through a sale in order to then transfer ownership of that animal from the old person to the new person. And you actually have to have bids on that animal, and you can be, as the facility owner or the trainer, you can be the bidder on that animal, but it's not automatic that the animal becomes yours. You have to literally go through this foreclosure process just like you would with a foreclosure sale on a house. Sometimes those are the cheapest and easiest way to go through this transfer of ownership process if the person won't voluntarily relinquish ownership of the horse to you. But they're not necessarily without their downside, in that if this is a registered animal that's registered with some breed association somewhere, you might run into difficulty getting that animal registered, the registration transferred into your name with that breed association, depending on what their own internal, their rules and processes are. So that's something to keep in mind. These possessory liens are not available to a veterinarian or a farrier because they're not in possession of that animal. But the farrier or the veterinarian may have another statutory lien available to them, and that's a non-possessory lien for somebody who's providing services like veterinary care or farrier services to an animal that is not in their possession. And that statute comes again with its own set of processes that you have to make sure that you follow through with. If you have the right language in a boarding agreement, you might have some language in there that allows you to claim what's called a security interest in the horse, to use it as collateral to secure any debt that may be owed to you. But again, you have to make sure that your boarding agreement has sort of the magic language in it to make sure that you have that right as much as possible. If you do have that right, you don't have to go through necessarily the same process that you would with the other statutory liens, because you would have a private right of sale and you could sell that horse to somebody else without going through the same sale process where you have an auction and things like that. You could advertise the horse, sell the horse, do something else with the horse. Or even lease the horse out short term if that's an option. But you have to have the magic language in your boarding agreement in order to have that right. So sort of it all falls back on what are your options available. They depend on your written contract and they depend on state statute. And I will also say that in Oregon, you know, it's the language that would potentially apply to a horse trainer is kind of a gray area, because the horse trainer, are they actually in possession of the horse, or is the boarding facility in possession of the horse? So if you are a trainer that works out of somebody else's facility, you know, you might not be as well protected as perhaps you think you are, because the boarding facility might have a superior right to the horse than you do, or you may not have coverage available to you under the state statute where you think you have a possessory lien right.
It's all gray area, isn't it?
It is.
So
it is.
So much of it goes back to having good quality agreements in the get-go, and working with someone like you who can think through all these scenarios and do the best you can, preparing language to protect the person that is putting the agreement together.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, you hear people, you know, stealing an agreement offline and changing the names around or something, and it just doesn't always fit for our state statutes and the rules that you'd have to have here in Oregon. So for something like that, is it, you know, a pretty easy call to someone like you to say, hey, I want to get some agreements created? I know I always have people say, oh, I can't go through that expense. And my answer is, you can't afford not to go through a small expense now to save you down the road.
Yes, not to sound too self-interested in my own business, but yes, you know, usually the money spent up front is going to help alleviate perhaps the expenditure of a significant amount of money once the problem arises. You know, I've had situations where clients unfortunately think that it's not money worth spending until they realize that it's, now they're looking at potentially spending thousands of dollars to collect money from somebody that doesn't have the money to repay them in the first place. So it can be a little bit of preventive medicine in that spending the money to get a contract drafted that's going to work for you and your business, rather than something that's sort of cookie cutter that you might find on the internet, whether it applies, Oregon law applies or not, or whether it's drafted in accordance with Oregon law or not. It's often much less expensive with a greater chance of recovering money at the end of the day if you have a contract prepared for you. I have seen situations where clients have gone with the sort of cookie cutter variety that they find online, and they think something is covered because it's mentioned to some degree in the contract, but the contract isn't actually tailored well enough to work with the actual specifics of their particular facility or their particular training program. Or it references state statutes of a different state, or it references provisions from another state. I did have a situation years ago where a client brought to me a liability release, a different contract, but it's a liability release, and it had the facility's pretty logo at the top of the first page. And it was about, I don't know, maybe a 1 or 2 page liability release, but the language in the liability release itself released from liability the barn from which this agreement had been lifted off of the internet. So it actually didn't relieve the barn owner that was using it and the facility that was using it from any liability, because the language hadn't been changed and adapted to account for the new barn that was using it. So it had the logo, but it didn't actually release anybody associated with the building or the facility or the business from liability at all. So if that had been questioned in a court of law, it, in my view, was unlikely to have held up.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like right now the thing to do is be proactive, whether you're a client who knows that, in 60 days you might not have enough income to cover, or whether you're an owner that is working with clients. Reach out, start that communication process. If you can work out a plan where you can adjust some things. We all know this won't last forever. This whole entire virus situation will go away and we will get back to some form of normal. No one knows exactly when, but if you can work together and keep those relationships if they're important to you, it's better to do that now than wait 60 or 90 days down the road when bills are due and nobody can pay them. So we appreciate all the advice that you've given us. If folks have any questions about contracts, or if they come up to a situation where they don't have a choice, Kathy has a fantastic resource. Her website, again, is pnwequinelaw.com. You can reach out to her, and she'd be one of the great resources in Oregon to help you through one of these processes if you have to. So Kathy, anything last to add?
Get it in writing. Get it in writing.
Always.
You change your agreement, send an email, send a text message, send something that actually memorializes or records that agreement. Even if you didn't have a written agreement before, document this change so that if somebody has a need to evaluate whether or not you are in the right, you've got it documented.
Always document. Well, thank you so much again for joining us today and your expertise. And we hope that this information is providing some of our facilities and clients across the state some good advice in what has been a difficult situation for all of us. So thanks, Kathy. We'll be talking to you.
You're welcome. And everybody stay safe out there.
Bye.
Bye-bye.